So today's video is looking at an introduction to criminal liability. The first thing that I want you to think about, and I'm not going to tell you the full answer in today's video, we're going to work up to that, but what is a crime? Now we're thinking legally here, we're not thinking about criminology, psychology, sociology, which may give you different answers as to what a crime is. We are looking at the legal definition. And what we're going to look at over the next few videos is the physical and mental elements required to commit a crime. And a crime is going to be something that attracts some sort of punishment, whatever that might be. What we're not looking at, and you need to dismiss from your mind a little bit, is the idea of a motive or any other moral arguments. So before we actually get started, we're going to have a look at some terminology, just so that you know exactly who we're talking about when we are discussing the different people involved. First of all, we have the defendant, who's sometimes referred to as the accused, or you might see them in textbooks or written down just referred to by the letter D. And this is the person who's on trial in a court because they've been accused of committing the crime. And it's important to remember that they are presumed innocent until they are proven guilty. So there might be a lot of evidence, but before the trial, the person is innocent. We also have the prosecution. The prosecution work on behalf of the Queen and the country. And they argue against the defendant, and they try to convince the jury or the magistrate that the defendant did whatever they are being accused of doing, and then they argue in respect of the punishment, assuming this person is found guilty. We also have the victim, who is the person who has suffered in some way as a result of the crime. We will be focusing our attention mainly on non-fatal offences, so there has to be some sort of individual or group of victims. In the English legal system, the victim doesn't particularly play a significant role in the trial. Now that's maybe something that you struggle to get your head around, or that you think is somewhat unfair. But it's important to remember that when we are prosecuting somebody for a crime, it's on behalf of you and me, the people of the country, who are saying that the behaviour that the defendant has been accused of, if a group of normal people are sure that they did that, then they deserve some sort of punishment. And the punishment may be in the form of retribution, to get revenge on behalf of the victim. But quite often there's a lot more to it than that. It may be for rehabilitation, to make them better. So although the victim is important in some respects, when it actually comes to the trial, they play a much lesser role. You may think that's unfair, but if you were the victim of a crime, it takes away that responsibility. You're not now responsible for getting your own back. The country does that on your behalf. So let's have a look first of all at the term actus reus. Now this is a Latin phrase, so don't worry if you're thinking I don't know what that means. And you may or may not be able to ascertain from looking at the word and hearing it said actus reus what this is all about. So actus reus is Latin for guilty act. And it's the act you need to do in order to commit an offence. Generally, it must be a voluntary act. So generally, you must actually do something, and you must do it voluntarily. So actually taking a bracelet is the actus reus of theft. Generally, it can't be an involuntary act. And an involuntary act was discussed in the case of Hill and Baxter. This is an important case that you'll come back to a few times. Worth going and having a look at exactly what was said in this case. But generally, the judge in the case said that if somebody was to lose control of a car that they were driving because they were attacked by a swarm of bees or because they were having a heart attack, they wouldn't be acting voluntarily. and therefore that wouldn't form the basis of the actus reus of a crime. So actus reus is the actual physical action taking place. Generally, it has to be voluntary, and generally it's a positive act, actually physically doing something. However, this can include an omission, and we'll have a look at omissions in more detail in a moment. So let's unpick a little bit more this voluntary act. So here's an example for you. I hold a knife in Ali's hands and he's much weaker than I am, and I force him to stab and kill Beth. Is Ali guilty of the crime of stabbing Beth? Well, it's probably common sense, isn't it, that no, Ali isn't guilty because it was not a voluntary act. If I put the knife in his hands and I manipulate him into using it, then it's my actus reus and he hasn't done anything wrong. Let's move on and have a look at action crimes. This is where the actus reus is actually an act. It's carrying out that particular act. So you do something that you're not supposed to do. And an example of this is if you're under oath and you tell a lie, then you have committed perjury. With an action crime, you don't have to have a result coming from that particular action. The fact that you carried out that action in the first place is sufficient. So I'm a witness in court and I've taken an oath promising to tell the truth. I'm asked whether I saw Tyler Cox stealing from John Lewis last Friday. I tell the court I did see him when really I didn't, but CCTV proves that he wasn't there at the time anyway, and he's found not guilty. Have I committed a crime? Well, from what we've already said, yes, by lying under oath, I have committed perjury. It doesn't matter that nobody believed me or that what I said was proven not to be true. It's still a crime. And it doesn't matter that it had no effect. If we move on and have a look at result crimes, the actus reus, the guilty act, not only requires the defendant to do something, but also requires that their behaviour brings about a certain result. So to be guilty of murder, what you did needs to result in somebody's death. So here's an example. I've had an argument with Sim and I hit him over the head with a rolling pin. And I know that I've hit him really hard and I did it on purpose. Am I guilty of murder? Well, bit of a trick question. Not if Sim isn't dead. You might be guilty of attempted murder because the action has to have the specific result of somebody actually dying. So let's move on and have a look at state of affairs crimes. Now you're going to hear this and you're going to say to me, I don't think that's fair. Well, when you're studying criminal law in particular, you're going to come across a variety of different things that don't seem to be very fair. The law is the law, and as lawyers, which is what we are, sometimes we do just have to accept that things may not be the way that we want them to be. So in a state of affairs crime, the actus reus, the guilty act, comes about because of the circumstances involved. And this can mean that people are guilty of a criminal offence just because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, even if they had no control over their actions. So let's have a look at an example of this. This is the case of R and Larsonneur, 1933. Now before we look specifically, 1933, this is before the EU acts in the way that it does at the moment. This is before we have the free movement of people throughout Europe. So if you wanted to go from one European country to another, whereas at the moment, if you've got an EU passport, you can just flash it and move into the other country. It's before that. So just keep that in mind. So Larsonneur was a French woman. She was a French citizen. And she was staying in England. And when she was no longer allowed to stay in England, she went to Ireland. On trying to enter Ireland, she is immediately sent back to England and handed over to English police on arrival because she is charged with being an alien without permission to be in England. This is where the term comes from, people. It's not necessarily an extraterrestrial. It's somebody who is somewhere that they are not allowed to be. And she is found guilty of being an alien, even though she was sent to England by the Irish police. She had no control over her actions. She was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. But by virtue of arriving in England, she is guilty of the crime. We will come back to have a look at a concept called strict liability a little bit later on, and I suspect that will make this case a little easier to understand. So following on from that, I'd like you to have a think about the word below, omission. Do you know what the definition of that word is, and could you use it in a sentence? So looking at what is an omission. An omission means a failure to act. Usually, an omission is not the basis of a criminal offence. There are, however, some specific exceptions to this rule where failing to act would be a criminal offence. We're going to look at 3 of these particular omissions categories, they're quite often referred to as, and a different category can be seen in each of the following cases: R and Pitwood, R and Stone and Dobinson, and R and Miller. There are other exceptions, but we're going to focus on 3. So looking first of all at the case of R and Pitwood, notice the date, it's 1902. And the omissions category is known as a duty arising from a contract. What happened in this case was the defendant was employed, his contract of employment, hence the contract part, to open and close a railway gate. He forgot to close the gate and went off on his lunch break. This was his omission, his failure to act. And he was convicted of manslaughter when somebody went onto the train track when they shouldn't have done because he'd forgotten to close the gate and was killed by an oncoming train. Because he was employed under the contract to do this duty, when he failed to do so, it resulted in somebody's death and therefore gave rise to criminal liability. So just to show you exactly what we're looking at a level crossing. Today a level crossing would all be computerized, and as you can see in the top picture, you've got the gates which come up and down. Now obviously in 1903 you wouldn't have had a computer to do it. It was this guy who failed to do his duty. And actually the person who got onto the train tracks was it using a horse and cart, because it wasn't there wasn't a car, it was a horse and cart. So you can see what the issue would be if something like in the bottom picture got onto the train tracks when there was a train coming. So the next case we have to have a look at is a case called R and Stone and Dobinson from 1977. And this omissions category is the duty arising from the assumption of responsibility. So Stone and Dobinson were girlfriend and boyfriend. They were both very elderly and struggling generally. Stone's sister, who everyone seems to remember her name was Fanny, came to live with them. They volunteered to look after her because she was anorexic and she needed a lot of help, but she stayed in her room all the time. Stone and Dobinson did nothing to help her, and eventually she died, and Stone and Dobinson were both convicted of gross negligence manslaughter. The argument was that they had voluntarily taken on the duty to look after her when they said that she could come and stay with them, and by failing to get help to look after her, they were responsible for her death. This is another one that some people would say was unfair, but the court argues that they were capable enough to take on the responsibility of looking after her, to volunteer their house for her to live in, so they therefore should have done what they could to help her, like calling a doctor when she was very ill. And the final case that we have to have a look at is a case of R and Miller from 1983. And the omissions category is the duty arising from starting a chain of events or creating a dangerous situation. This one is sometimes called different names. Whichever one you choose to call it is absolutely fine. So Miller was a squatter being somebody who is living and sleeping somewhere that they're not supposed to. Usually we're looking at somebody who breaks into an abandoned house, not squatter as in the thing you do at the gym. So Miller was a squatter who fell asleep smoking, and the mattress that he was asleep on started to burn. He woke up, noticed the burning, but instead of doing something about it, he just went into another room and went back to sleep. The fire spread and caused severe damage, and he was found guilty of arson, not for the initial fire because that was just an accident, but because he created a dangerous situation by failing to stop the fire when he first noticed it. So, using all the information that you've seen in this video, you are now going to be able to create a revision card which would answer the following questions. Explain with cases the meaning of the term actus reus. This is a 7-mark question, and it requires you to define actus reus, explain that it is usually voluntary with the case of Hill and Baxter, and it's usually a positive action. But then you're going to be able to illustrate where it's not voluntary, as in your state of affairs crimes, and your 3 omissions categories. And this is a 7-mark answer. If you're not sure, pop back through the video and look up any things that you're not sure about, but you should now be able to answer that question.